Thanks again, Claire. Thanks for inviting me. Lovely to see you all here from places as far abroad as Canada, I've just learned. Now, I won't be able to speak to that, I'm afraid. I will be speaking, which is already, I think, a bit of a stretch, about the national picture, and that starts off with the United Kingdom, but then focuses down on England. Before I start, I really don't think I've met all of you in the past. So I'm Dr. Jurgen Grotz. I'm the director of the Institute for Volunteering Research here at our University of East Anglia. My colleague Linda Burt, in fact, and who is here as well, and I very much looking forward to hear from you and hear your reflections of what you've learned over the last 18 months and how that will inform approaches to volunteer recruitment and management in the future. But before you go into breakout groups, Amelia had asked me to speak about the national picture in 15 minutes, she said. And now I need to set my alarm clock to stop me after 15 minutes. I literally started it now. Because it's a bit of a challenge. Before I go into the context, you might absolutely reasonably ask, why him? What does he know? So the Institute for Volunteering Research has been around for 24 years, but only just got to UEA about 3 years ago. Yes, 24 years, so big anniversary coming up next year. And as the name of the Institute suggests, we basically want to know everything about volunteering wherever it takes place. And so if I look back at the last 12 months, I've been part of a very large ESRC, that's the Economic and Social Research Council, funded project, nearly £500,000, to look at mobilizing of volunteers and voluntary action in all the 4 nations of the UK, where we're working with all the national infrastructure organizations in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, trying to find out more. I'm happy to always direct you later on at some more information about this, but that's been really insightful. I've also undertaken work with participant observers in Kensington and Chelsea, interviewing people who were organizing mutual aid organizations. We worked over the last 12 months with Network Rail and looking how their employer-supported volunteering worked. That included questions about during the pandemic. I've worked with other colleagues because there's an awful lot of research going on. So we've set up, for example, the COVID-19 research repository, where you can see it's about 20-30 research projects that have been going on over the last year. Many of them starting to report, some of them are already reporting, but that's where I learn a lot as well about, and I will refer to some of that in a moment. But also in Norwich, I was really delighted and working, for example, with Amelia in the hyperlocal network and with the friendly Fine City Neighbours network. So that's the type of things where I'm learning from. So I've been able to interview volunteers, but also CEOs from the really, really large volunteer involving organizations, local government, national government in England, but also elsewhere. So I'm getting different stuff feeding in. Some of it I will point you to already reporting, others not. So that's why me. So what have I learned from this, if anything? The first thing we need to recognize is when we talk about the national picture, that it is different within the nations. So the picture in England is quite different to the picture in Scotland. And for example, when it came to sort of the health response, Northern Ireland looked quite different. And we need to just basically appreciate those divergences, because everything relating to volunteering and volunteering policies, those are not matters reserved for the UK Parliament. Those are devolved powers. So it is the national governments of the four nations, or at least of England, Scotland, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that make decisions around that. And the divergence has been quite important. The next one is, it's also different across England. And so, for example, when I was speaking to people in North Kensington, had, for example, the Grenfell Tower fire, had sort of riots many decades ago. A very different story, or a very different background, for example, to the one I find here in Norwich. But also then the way local authorities and the voluntary community sector organisations work together is quite different, even during the pandemic. And then also, it's really important, the national picture depends on what you ask. And for over the last 12 months, I have made a point of asking, how are you? Asking the people, how are they? And the overwhelming feedback, and this goes across all nations and across all regions and localities that I've encountered, was that I found people was really tired after a really enormous effort of trying to deal with the pandemic and adjusting and doing this and doing that, and working way beyond what they probably would have otherwise done, and were tired from that. But they were also really anxious, and that differs. Some people don't want to hug, others do. Some people don't really want to return to the underground or to a busy office. Others do. They sort of individually quite variable anxiety about what is for them the right thing. And obviously that extends to how do you involve volunteers, and that, I think, led to the third feeling, which is about feeling quite uncertain as to where to go next and how to do it next, knowing that not only are we ourselves anxious about how things, we know that the volunteers who we involve are anxious and uncertain. How does this work? Those are three really sort of important feelings that I've got. And now, because I'm never really sure about these things, if you don't mind, just put in the chat whether or not that resonates with you or not. While I'm presenting, I can't look at the chat, but I would really welcome to look at that later and just see whether or not it resonates. A yes or no, or no, Jurgen, you're awful. Just be frank about that. So that's the national picture and the caution that we have to apply when we look at the national picture. I said the national picture is different throughout England. And so what does that mean? The main thing that I found was that local authorities responded very differently to things. So some worked with the local voluntary sector directly, with the volunteer involving organizations directly. Others worked with infrastructure organizations, and yet others sort of ran two things in parallel, where the local authority was doing their own thing, and not unusual either to find all three approaches just somehow mixed up and muddled up. That's absolutely fine. Of course it is. Local authorities can find their own way, but that left the volunteers, and that is a finding that I had when I was looking at stuff with volunteers. They felt caught or uncertain between the local authority organizing something, the MPs telling them to do something, voluntary sector, and the organizations they've been working with all along. And then there were apps that they could sign up to. And what am I going to do now? How do I get involved? And we're sort of getting caught up in that a little bit. So when I'm saying it was different throughout England, it sort of that affected people because there was an element of uncertainty around that. The really big question, it got reported quite loudly that so many new people had signed up as volunteers, and they were coming from different backgrounds, and we were seeing a new dawn of volunteering with so many people coming up. Now, according to the latest figures of the government themselves, that isn't entirely the full picture here. So these are the numbers from the Community Life Survey. It was called something different a bit back, but been going for a really significant number of years. And by and large, since a sort of high of around the turn of the millennium, numbers overall have been falling slowly, and the pandemic has not actually changed that. The one thing it has changed, if you can see it on the screen, I'm not sure you can, is this line of the formal dropping off quite dramatically, and the informal making up for that to a degree. Obviously, these numbers are always delayed. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe we'll see a massive spike after that. But having followed this for a while, having followed that, for example, during the Olympics and in other times when people were telling us that we are at a new dawn of volunteering, not entirely sure. My expectation at the moment would be, with such trend lines that are being maintained, that we will probably see a return to the pre-pandemic levels and fluctuations every year a little bit. But that's me predicting things. But the main thing is, overall, of the millions and millions of people who volunteer, some volunteer different at the moment or have volunteered differently during the pandemic, but the vast majority is still here and are still doing it. But we haven't seen a dramatic spike. So I need to catch up with my own notes here, and I'm mindful of time to speak a little bit faster. So what does that actually mean at the moment? I don't know whether you've seen it, but Lord Hague was calling. It was yet another person who was calling for a new army of volunteers. This time, he wanted to see that beating loneliness. It's quite a common call in politics, and it's one that's not necessarily supported by the sort of the great diversity of volunteering, because people are not just standing to attention to meet a particular policy goal. They volunteer in all different aspects of life. The reason why I'm highlighting it, because during the pandemic, we have seen, and I think it is a fair description, a real lack of a volunteering voice nationally in policy making. And that seems to sort of re-emerge to a degree. We have two initiatives at the moment. One is called Shaping the Future of Volunteering Group. That is very large, the CEOs of very large national volunteer involving organizations. And then we have another body called Division of Volunteering, that's NCVO, Volunteering Matters, and AFCA and AVM working together. And if you want to get involved, just I can give you the link or Google it. You can get involved. So in the absence of a clear vision and a clear position, it's not surprising that calls like that emerge and maybe are not sufficiently contextualized. That is part of the national picture at the moment. This is exacerbated by the fact, and I checked this morning, so hopefully things haven't changed yet, but we haven't even got a minister for volunteering. Baroness Barron is no longer the minister, okay, at least according to the official guidance here, and no new one has been appointed. But also during the pandemic, we have not seen a real drive coming out of DCM, the Department of Culture, Media and Sports, that was sort of, substantially directing the sort of volunteering picture or response. That is probably changing, and I come to that in a second. But I guess it's important just to realize how difficult the situation is and remains, and that we are still in a process of finding our policy feet in England, at least. So how does that, now I've got a minute or so, hurry up. The key part in changes that I would expect are the changes that reflect the changes in society. So when we want to predict stuff, when we want to consider stuff, it's worth looking and understanding the long-term societal impacts of the pandemic, and maybe look at reports by the British Academy and others, and really understand that. And that will tie in quite closely, or I expect will tie in quite closely, to how volunteering develops. In terms of English policy, you might have heard of levelling up, and Andy Haldane is now tasked to head up this task force. He was the chief economist of the Bank of England, and he coined the phrase, I don't know whether he did, but he certainly used it, of community capitalism. And so he will have quite a view and an input into that sort of policy development. And I think that might be worth following a little bit in terms of understanding where the national picture on volunteering goes. In summary, these sort of questions that I've encountered, and I didn't push this too hard, about, the tiredness, the anxiety and so forth, doesn't necessarily match up with the sort of things that we've heard from Lord Hague. Overall, the numbers from on the evidence that I see have not changed as dramatically as they have been reported, or at least I would expect them to return to a level that they were probably before. That's guesswork, but where I would be expecting. There is currently in England no strong sense of leadership. So we haven't got a minister. The sort of infrastructure bodies are sorting themselves out. The volunteer, the organizations are forming pictures. But during the pandemic, we have not really seen a strong element of that. And when it comes to the changes in practice, I think we need to orientate ourselves mostly, therefore, in the societal changes. So, how do people deal with meetings, with those sorts of things, and then look at our practice in that way. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Especially for my colleagues in Norfolk, but also for the colleagues in Canada who are on the call, I will always try and make time for inquiries. I might sometimes just point you in the direction of further evidence. I can't do the research for you necessarily, but I will always try and find time to direct you at least a little bit. But if before you do, maybe do have a look at our website. There is quite a lot of interesting stuff on there. It's not easily to search. Forgive me for that, but if you scroll around a bit and just have a little bit of a look, you find some resources there that might also be helpful. I have overrun. This is not how I usually act. I do apologize. I thank you so much for listening and your time, and look forward to hearing more in the breakout room.